Dust swirled around the wooden platform as the auctioneer's gavel slammed down. Every girl had been claimed, leaving 19-year-old Clara shivering in the bitter cold. "Nobody picked me," she whispered, her spirit breaking. Then a towering, scarred figure in bearskin stepped from the shadows. "Mine," he rumbled. The wind howling through Bitter Creek, Wyoming, in November of 1883 carried the biting promise of an early winter. 19-year-old Clara Higgins stood on a makeshift wooden platform erected in front of the town's only livery stable, her thin cotton dress offering no protection against the freezing gusts. Her hands were raw, her lips blue, and her heart pounded, a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She was the last one left. Just 2 weeks prior, Clara had been loaded onto an iron-slatted rail car in Chicago, alongside 36 other wards of the St. Jude Asylum. They were told they were going west to find Christian homes to become domestic helpers, or respectable wives for the hardy pioneers settling the frontier. The reality was far more mercantile. Reverend Josiah Boone, the opportunistic man who had orchestrated the journey, called it a placement drive. The men of Bitter Creek called it what it was, a bride auction. For hours, the town's bachelor miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers had paraded past the line of girls. They pinched arms, checked teeth like they were inspecting cattle, and haggled with the Reverend over the charitable donation required to take a girl home. Clara watched as the stronger girls, the ones with rosy cheeks and sturdy hips, were claimed first. Then went the pretty ones, swept up by men in moderately clean woolen suits. Clara was neither strong nor pretty, or so she had been told her entire life. Years of surviving on watered-down gruel and enduring the harsh discipline of the asylum matrons had left her dangerously thin. A childhood accident had left her with a slight limp in her left leg, and her face was heavily bruised from a recent violent backhand delivered by Reverend Boone when she had begged for an extra blanket on the train. She kept her head bowed, her tangled auburn hair hiding her wide, terrified green eyes. "Well, Reverend," sneered Mayor Horace Campbell, shifting a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek. "Looks like you brought a runt in this litter. Ain't nobody going to pay a $20 donation for a crippled sparrow." Reverend Boone grabbed Clara by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her fragile flesh, and dragged her to the center of the platform. "She is a hard worker. Gentlemen, mends clothes flawlessly and knows how to keep her mouth shut. Do I hear $10? $10 for a dutiful girl." Silence stretched over the dusty street, broken only by the whistling wind and the nervous stamping of horses. Men averted their eyes. Some muttered about the cost of feeding a girl who looked like she'd blow away in the next storm. Clara trembled a single tear, cutting a clean track through the soot on her cheek. Nobody picked me. She thought, the crushing weight of a lifetime of abandonment settling over her. She was worthless. Even in a territory starved for women, she was unwanted. Then the crowd parted as a man stepped forward. Jebediah Emma was the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, a man whose expensive beaver felt hat and silver-tipped boots hid a reputation for unparalleled cruelty. He owned half the town and commanded the other half through fear. He looked Clara up and down with dark, predatory eyes that made her skin crawl. "I'll give you $5, Boone," Emma drawled, lighting a cigar. "She's too frail to work a ranch, but she'll do well enough scrubbing my floors and warming the bed when the nights get long." A sickening laugh rippled through a few of Emma's ranch hands. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a cold sweat breaking out on her neck. She knew what happened to girls who went to Emma's ranch. They were broken, used, and often disappeared by spring. $5 it is. Mr. Emma. Reverend Boone cheered, eager to be done with the business and get to the saloon. sold to 50. The voice did not come from the crowd. It came from the alleyway beside the livery, a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the platform. Every head turned. Stepping out of the shadows was a giant of a man. He stood well over 6 feet, clad in heavy canvas trousers and a massive coat made of raw bear hide. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but a jagged pale scar cut a vicious line from his left temple down across his cheekbone. He wore no hat, letting the wind whip his shoulder-length dark hair, and carried a lever-action Winchester rifle with terrifying ease. It was Ethan Cole. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The mountain man, the hermit of Blacktooth Peak. They say he killed 3 outlaws with his bare hands last winter. Ethan rarely came down to Bitter Creek, only appearing twice a year to trade high-quality pelts for salt coffee and ammunition. Ethan didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the mayor. His piercing blue eyes were locked entirely on Clara. Jebediah Emma's face flushed with anger. "Now see here, Cole. You stay out of town business. I already made a bid." Ethan ignored him. He walked slowly up the wooden stairs of the platform. The timber groaned under his immense weight. He reached inside his heavy coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and tossed it onto the auctioneer's barrel. It landed with the unmistakable heavy clink of solid gold. $50 in gold. Ethan repeated his voice, dangerously calm. He looked at Reverend Boone, whose eyes were bulging at the fortune. "She's mine." Boone scrambled to grab the pouch. Yes. Sold to Mr. Cole." Emma took a threatening step forward, his hand drifting toward his holster. "You think you can just wander down from the rocks and insult me, Cole?" Ethan turned his massive frame slowly. He didn't reach for his rifle, nor did he touch the heavy hunting knife strapped to his thigh. He simply stared at Emma with cold, dead-eyed intensity. "The bid was open, Emma. I closed it. You have a problem, you can try and solve it right here." The tension in the air was so thick it could choke a horse. For a long, terrifying moment, Emma weighed his pride against his life. He looked at the scars on Ethan's face, the unblinking stare, and slowly moved his hand away from his gun. "You'll regret crossing me for a sickly, stray mountain man." Emma spat before turning on his heel and storming away. Ethan turned his attention back to Clara. She was shaking so violently, her teeth chattered, terrified, that she had just traded a cruel master for a murderous monster. Ethan took a step closer, towering over her. He reached out a massive, calloused hand. Clara flinched, bracing for a strike. Instead, he gently unhooked the clasp of his heavy bear hide coat, slid it off his shoulders and wrapped it around her frail body. The coat engulfed her, radiating a ferocious, comforting heat that smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and clean leather. "Come on," Ethan said softly, his voice losing its rough edge. "We have a long ride, and it's getting cold." The journey up to Blacktooth Peak was a grueling, bone-chilling ascent that took them far away from the dusty misery of Bitter Creek. Clara rode in front of Ethan on his massive Percheron draft horse, Brutus. The animal's broad back and Ethan's solid chest behind her were the only things keeping her from freezing as the elevation climbed and the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes. For hours, Ethan didn't speak. He simply guided the horse up treacherous winding switchbacks, navigating the dense forests of spruce and aspen with practiced ease. Clara was exhausted, her body aching from the train ride and the lingering sting of the Reverend's beating, but fear kept her awake. Who was this man? Why would a solitary trapper pay $50 in gold for a girl who couldn't even lift a sack of flour? He must have bought her for the darkest of reasons. By the time they reached the tree line, dusk had fallen, painting the snow in shades of violet and deep blue. Tucked away in a natural alcove of sheer granite stood a cabin. It wasn't the dilapidated hovel Clara had imagined. It was a large, sturdy structure, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, the chinks expertly sealed against the wind. A stone chimney breathed a welcoming plume of smoke into the twilight sky. Ethan dismounted easily and reached up, wrapping his large hands around Clara's waist. He lifted her down as if she weighed no more than a feather, setting her gently on the snow-packed porch. He opened the heavy oak door and gestured for her to go inside. Clara stepped in, clutching the oversized bear coat around her. The interior was surprisingly warm and meticulously clean. A cast-iron stove radiated heat from the corner. Bundles of dried herbs and salted meats hung from the rafters. The floorboards were swept clean, and against one wall sat a large wooden bookshelf packed tight with leather-bound volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry. It was not the den of a savage. "Sit by the fire," Ethan said, pulling off his leather gloves and moving to light a kerosene lantern on the heavy oak table. "You're half frozen." Clara hobbled over to a rocking chair near the stove, her bad leg aching terribly from the cold. Ethan moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He ladled a generous portion of venison and root vegetable stew from a pot simmering on the stove into a tin bowl, cut a thick slice of dense sourdough bread, and handed it to her. "Eat slowly," he advised, his eyes flickering briefly to the dark bruise covering the side of her face. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he said nothing of it. If you haven't had real food in a while, it'll make you sick to eat too fast. Clara took a tentative bite. The rich, savory warmth of the stew exploded in her mouth, bringing tears to her eyes. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She ate in silence, watching Ethan as he checked the windows, drew the heavy wool curtains, and fed more logs into the stove. Finally, Clara couldn't bear the silence anymore. She set the empty bowl down, her hands shaking. Why did you buy me, Mr. Cole?" Her voice was a raspy whisper. "I have no strength. I don't know how to skin a buck or chop wood. If you bought a wife, I don't—" She choked on her words, terror gripping her throat. Ethan stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at her, his rugged face entirely unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He walked over, pulled out a heavy wooden chair, and sat across from her. "I didn't buy a wife, Miss Higgins," Ethan said quietly. Clara froze. "How do you know my name? Reverend Boone only called me the girl." Ethan reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small object and placed it gently on the table between them. Clara leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. It was a small, crudely carved wooden robin. The wings were chipped, and the wood was smooth from years of being handled. "Where did you get that?" Clara gasped, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the bird. My brother Thomas made this for me when I was 8 years old. I lost it at the asylum. The matrons took it. Thomas didn't lose his," Ethan corrected gently. "He carried its twin in his pocket every day. He showed it to me often. Talked about the little sister he had to leave behind in Chicago when he came west to make his fortune." Clara's heart hammered. "You knew Tommy. Where is he? Is he here?" She looked around the cabin frantically, a desperate, impossible hope flaring in her chest. Ethan's eyes softened with a deep, profound sorrow. "I'm sorry, Clara. Thomas passed away 3 months ago. Cave-in down at the Silver Bell mine over in the Wind River Gorge." Clara let out a ragged sob, burying her face in her hands. The one thread of hope she had clung to all these years, that her big brother would strike it rich and come back for her, was gone. Before he died, Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He lay in the dirt for 2 days. I was the one who dug him out. He knew he wasn't going to make it. He made me promise him 2 things. First, he gave me $50 in gold dust he'd hidden away, and told me to track down the St. Jude Asylum and buy his sister's freedom. He knew the orphan trains were coming through this season. Clara wiped her eyes, looking at the scarred giant. And the second thing, he told me to protect you from Jebediah, Emma. Clara blinked in confusion. Mr. Emma. But why I don't know him. I only saw him for the first time today. Ethan leaned forward, his massive hands clasped on the table, because Thomas didn't just work at the Silver Bell. He spent his nights prospecting the deep ravines. A week before he died, he found it. The mother lode. A silver vein so thick you could carve it with a spoon, sitting right under a natural spring in the gorge. He filed the deed quietly in the territorial office. Ethan stood up, pacing to the window and peering out into the dark, swirling snow. Emma owns the mayor, and the mayor runs the claims office. They found out about Thomas's claim. I don't think that cave-in was an accident, Clara. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. But what does that have to do with me? Under territorial law, if a man dies without a wife or children, his deed passes to his next of kin, Ethan explained, turning back to her. Emma knew Thomas had a sister in Chicago. He paid Reverend Boone to ensure you were on that specific train, brought to that specific town. Emma planned to buy you for $5, force you to marry him before a corrupt judge tonight, and take legal control of the richest silver claim in Wyoming. The horrifying realization washed over Clara. The auction, the humiliation, Emma's vile offer it, had all been a trap, and she had almost fallen perfectly into it. When I rode into town for supplies and saw Boone setting up that platform, I knew Emma would make his move. Ethan said, his hand dropping to rest on the stock of his rifle. I couldn't let Thomas's sister fall into the hands of the man who likely murdered him. They won't just let this go, Clara whispered, looking at the door as if Emma's men were about to chop it down with axes. You embarrassed him. You took millions of dollars right out of his hands. He'll kill us. Ethan looked at the fragile, bruised girl, trembling in his chair. The scars on his face tightened, and his blue eyes hardened into chips of Arctic ice. He walked over to the corner, picked up a heavy belt strung with cartridges, and slung it over his shoulder. They can try. The quiet mountain man rumbled the sound, echoing like distant thunder in the small cabin. But they are coming up my mountain now, and on Blacktooth Peak I don't miss. The blizzard descended on Blacktooth Peak, like a living thing smothering the cabin in white and stealing the world beyond its walls. Inside the stove hissed and popped, and the steady clack of brass cartridges sliding into Ethan Cole's Winchester marked the passing seconds. Outside was chaos. Inside was preparation. Clara sat near the fire, the bare hide coat heavy on her shoulders, her hands clenched tight in her lap. The truth about her brother's death and the silver claim that made her a target had shattered the last illusion of safety she possessed. Emma didn't want her labor. He wanted her erased. They'll come, Ethan said, quietly, not looking up. Men don't fear storms when greed's louder. The first shot proved him right. Glass exploded inward, and Ethan crossed the room in a blur, throwing Clara to the floor as another bullet tore through the chair she'd occupied a heartbeat earlier. He shielded her with his body, then shoved her toward the stove. Stay low. Iron'll stop around. Torches flickered beyond the window. 5 men moved through the trees. At their head stood Gideon Cross. Ethan fired once. A scream answered. Then the cabin shook under return fire bullets, thudding into logs. Smoke and splinters filled the room. Clara pressed her palms to her ears, panic clawing at her chest. I brought this, she thought. I'm the reason he'll die. Then she saw the scattergun on the floor. Her brother had fought in darkness for her. She would not hide now. She crawled forward, dragging her bad leg, and loaded the gun with shaking hands. When Ethan turned and saw her offering it, something fierce and startled flashed across his face. I won't let them kill you, she said. Tell me how to help. Load, he said, handing her the Winchester. Watch the back door. For an hour they held. Ethan shot with ruthless precision. Clara fed cartridges, her fingers raw, her fear burned down to focus. When fire came down the chimney, Ethan smothered it with a blanket, his hands blistering as smoke filled the cabin. The door burst open. Gideon lunged in revolver raised. Clara moved without thought. The poker swung. Iron met bone. Gideon collapsed, and Ethan finished it with one crushing blow. Outside, the others fled into the storm. Silence fell, thick, gasping. Ethan was bleeding. Clara tended the wound with steady hands, whiskey and linen. She traced scars older than she was, and when he spoke of betrayal and blood and being left to die, she touched his face. I didn't run, she whispered. He leaned into her palm. The moment shattered when Gideon groaned awake. Under the barrel of Ethan's gun, the truth spilled, forged papers, a stolen marriage, a legal noose tightening at dawn. 50 men. Ethan looked to the storm beyond the window. We don't go down, he said. We go over. Clara's fear steadied into resolve. She placed her hands over his. I trust you. Let's go. They left 2 hours before dawn, slipping into a world erased by white. Ethan secured Gideon Cross to the iron bedframe, left him water, and trusted the storm and Emma's greed to do the rest. Clara rode Brutus, bundled in wool, and the massive bear coat her hands lost inside Ethan's fur mittens. Ethan broke trail on foot, waist-deep in fresh powder, hauling the reins and carving a narrow path through the mountain's fury. Crossing Blacktooth Peak was a waking nightmare. Wind screamed needles of ice, scoured skin, and breath burned in the lungs. For 6 brutal hours they climbed. Clara's injured leg throbbed, but she said nothing. She watched Ethan shoulder the storm with inhuman resolve, each step an act of defiance against the cold that had once tried to kill them both. By mid-morning, the sky cracked open, blue and pitiless, revealing a mountain buried beneath an unstable crown of snow. They reached Dead Man's Drop, a switchback etched into sheer granite. Rock towered to their left, overhung with cornices heavy as sin. To the right, a ravine plunged into black pines. Slow, Ethan warned. Stay close to the wall. Loud noise could bring it down. They were halfway across when a metallic click sliced the silence. Ethan shoved Clara and Brutus hard against the rock as Jebediah Emma appeared ahead, flanked by armed riders. He wore victory like a grin. You're out of trail, Emma mocked. Slip and fall and the widower's story stays clean. Ethan stepped forward, shielding Clara. He couldn't outdraw 11 men, but he could see the mountain. Hold on, he roared. He swung Brutus's Winchester, not at men, but sky, and fired. The shot cracked like thunder. Emma's return fire shattered stone near Ethan's head. You missed, Emma laughed. No. Ethan said, eyes lifted. I didn't. The mountain answered. A groan rolled through the rock. Powder spilled, then the ridge tore loose. White death thundered down. Emma screamed. Horses reared. There was nowhere to run. Ethan slapped Brutus into retreat and ran behind them as the avalanche slammed the ledge. Men and mounts vanished over the edge in a boiling cloud. The tail end clipped Ethan Ice, struck his back, flinging him forward. He skidded, claws scraping, then dropped. No, Clara screamed. Ethan dangled over the abyss, one arm useless the other, gripping a root that was tearing free. Clara moved without thinking. She looped Brutus's lariat to the saddle, threw the line, and leaned out. Grab it, Ethan let go and lunged. Leather bit into his palms. Clara dug in and shouted Brutus forward. The rope groaned. Inch by inch, Ethan rose. She hauled him over the edge, sobbing with effort. They collapsed, breathless, alive. "You saved me," Ethan whispered. "We saved each other," Clara said. Days later in Cheyenne, the truth fell like a hammer. Deeds were restored. Corruption burned. Clara claimed her name and her future. A month after, there was no auction block, only vows. Clara stood tall despite her limp. Ethan stood beside her scar-bared eyes, steady. They built their life high on Blacktooth Peak, and the legend endured not of strength alone, but of choosing the unloved and standing fast when the mountain answers back. What an incredible journey of survival and unexpected love on the brutal frontier. If you were captivated by Clara and Ethan's fight against all odds to find their happily ever after, please hit that like button right now. Share this dramatic Wild West story with your friends who love a great twist. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding, romantic adventures every single week.